Hello, and thank you for joining us. Isn't it great that modern technology can bring us together at this time of social distancing? Even though we can't be together for the actual film premiere, certainly this is the next best thing. I'm Lynne Malcolm, host of the ABC radio program and podcast All in the Mind. And I'm delighted to be joined now by our wonderful panel who we've just seen appear in the film. It's great to be with Shannon Harvey, the award-winning director of two internationally acclaimed documentaries, The Connection, Mind Your Body, and the one you've just seen, My Year of Living Mindfully. Her book, The Whole Health Life, is about finding good health after being diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. Shannon is the recipient of the National Press Club of Australia's Health Journalist of the Year award, and now produces a popular blog whilst balancing her health and being the mother of two adventurous boys. Also with us is Associate Professor Craig Hassard, who's been working with the Faculty of Medicine at Monash University since 1989. His teaching, research and clinical interests include mindfulness, mind-body medicine, lifestyle medicine, integrative medicine and medical ethics. Craig developed and integrated into the Monash medical curriculum the world-first mindfulness-based healthy lifestyle course called the Health Enhancement Program. Craig is a regular media commentator and has published 13 books and 14 book chapters. He featured in the documentaries The Connection and My Year of Living Mindfully. In 2019, Craig was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for services to medicine. And it's lovely to be speaking again with Amit Bernstein. He's Professor of Psychology at the University of Haifa, where he's the director of the Observing Minds Lab and Moments of Refuge project. Amit's basic science research has focused on the nature of attention in mental life and in turn the curative mechanisms of mindfulness training. His group's applied research is focused on how mindfulness training may be used to promote resilience and recovery among refugees and asylum seekers struggling with trauma, loss and stress. Shannon, we'll start with you. You made this film with your husband, Jules. What was that like?
Well, fortunately, Jules is a wonderfully amazing human being. So I will share this though. We met when we were in university and we made a documentary together, and that's when we sort of fell in love and, started a wonderful relationship. And then we made another documentary and we broke up. And when we decided to get back together again, it was on the condition that we would never make another film together. So we obviously broke that rule when we made My Year of Living Mindfully, but I think we've both done a lot of growing up since then. So yeah, we're still together.
So how did you go about setting up your Year of Living Mindfully? How did you get started and how did it progress?
I actually had a really long conversation with Craig. I don't know if you remember that, Craig. And I sought his advice on what would be good markers to look at physiologically throughout the year. That was really informative. And then Craig also helped guide me about in sort of setting up a structure of the experiment. And I spoke to a number of other mindfulness teachers, and we decided that it would be good to start sort of slowly in a really typical way, how many people start with the app. And I committed to 20 minutes a day. And what became quite clear after that, I sort of experimented with different apps, but it was that I needed guidance from an actual teacher. And that's how I progressed to the 8-week mindfulness-based stress reduction course that I did with Timothy at Goddard. And that was really, really pivotal, because I not only started meditating for 45 minutes a day through the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, but it was also because I joined others and I had guidance from a teacher. And that was great. And then I think laid a really good foundation for the kind of the marathon equivalent of mindfulness, which was the 10-day silent retreat. And I felt really prepared going into that. Yeah.
So we'll come back to you later on the role that meditation is now playing in your life. But just before we do that, was there a point at which the meditation became less of a chore for you during the year?
Oh, again, this is confession time, but sometimes meditation still is a chore. So I still find it really difficult to find the time to meditate. But I also know that it has such a profound effect in my daily life that it's worthwhile doing. As for the actual moment, I think there really was that moment of peace that we managed to include as part of the story in the film. That moment that happened while I was on my way back from doing a presentation in Melbourne, and just experienced the kind of stripping away of the me, thinking, planning, strategizing, meaning making, wanting, craving version of me, and that all just momentarily stopped. And I thought, okay, this is worthwhile pursuing.
I think that's one of the things that many people assume about mindfulness and find difficult about it, is that there's some assumption it's always going to be easy. It's always going to, and it's not. It's often quite challenging. And it's like physical exercise. Some days you're bound out the door and you're ready to go for a run and you power up the hill. And other days it's just hard work. It doesn't mean the benefits aren't there. But if there's a commitment to it, you do it anyway, whether it's easy or not. And I think that's important.
So Craig, with your medical background, is mindfulness becoming more acceptable in mainstream medicine, or is there still a bit of a skeptical attitude towards it?
I'd say that if you went back 10, 20 years, the skepticism would have been 90% and the openness and application of it 10. And I think it's probably, maybe it's not 90% acceptance now, but I think the balance has swung very much in its favour, because firstly, all of the good research, and naturally doctors are interested in what evidence is there, and the evidence base has certainly grown enormously in the last 10 years in particular, and people are more informed about it. And I think a lot of doctors are also hearing from their patients, even if they're not looking at it themselves, their patients are saying to them, oh, it's really helped me with my anxiety, it's helped me with my anger, it's helped me with my pain, it's helped me with... And doctors don't tend to ignore too much for too long what their patients are telling them. And I think that's been one of the really transformative things as well.
So do you feel that mindfulness has a really strong role to play in medicine in the future? And at what level? Is it at the patient level, the hospital level, the doctor level?
All of those,
yes.
And probably a few more, I'd say. So in the medical faculty at Monash, so we see it on many different levels. So firstly, in the training of medical students, for them to be a mindful medical practitioner, for them to look after their own mental health and well-being, but to be more mindful in the process of communicating, and when they're doing difficult procedures, to really have their attention where they need it to be. And so firstly for them, but secondly to inform them about the things that could be helpful for their patients one day. And not like mindfulness is going to replace every other treatment and so on, but to know that for very many things, it'd be hard to think of too many, that it can't play either it is the treatment, or it's an adjunctive treatment to other things that are being done. And so for doctors to know, the doctors of the future, to know much more about where this would be appropriate in their medical care, but also systemically. And a lot of hospitals are getting very interested in bringing mindfulness much more widely across, and it's not just for doctors, of course, but allied health professionals as well, but bringing it into the hospital so that it becomes a part of the culture, a part of the way that people relate to each other, a way that people engage in teams, and the emotional intelligence, mindful leadership. So, because hospitals can be very difficult environments, and I'd much rather have a mindful team than an unmindful one. And the impacts that it has on being more pro-social and so on. So it really, I think, operates on many different levels.
So I guess crucial in that though is for people to know that they're getting good quality teaching in courses or with apps. How can people know that the quality is there?
Well, I think that's an important issue. That sometimes, if somebody doesn't understand mindfulness, like a doctor doesn't or a psychologist doesn't, and just reads a book or even a book chapter about it, or just goes to a 1 hour workshop and thinks, oh, well, that sounds pretty simple, I'll start using it. It doesn't take too long before you can realize, and especially dealing with quite complex issues, you really want to know your mindfulness well, and you also need your mental health credentials, to be pretty good as well. You need your medical credentials. So I think to use it in complex medical situations, you do need very good training as a health professional, but you need to really understand your mindfulness well. Now, having a lesser level of understanding about mindfulness, just a kind of a familiarity with it, I think can be more appropriate for having a conversation, for being able to recommend it, for and knowing where somebody can find some teaching from a trained, expert in mindfulness. Because as Shannon was saying before, it makes a big difference when you're sitting down and learning from somebody who understands it from the inside out. And so, but nevertheless, at least if health professionals are informed about it, they can recommend it in appropriate ways so that patients can get that kind of support.
Mm. So, Amit Bernstein, you've been exploring the potential that mindfulness could offer to refugees, many of whom have experienced terrible trauma and grief. What inspired you to think that mindfulness could really help in such extreme cases?
Well, candidly, when we started this work about, I'd say, a decade ago, 10 years, and if you would have asked me then, ultimately, what do you think you're going to learn from your findings might be a reasonable, effective, safe, disseminable, social, culturally sensitive framework for caring for diverse populations of refugees and asylum seekers. I don't think that I would have thought at all to say, oh yeah, mindfulness-based interventions. But what happened was that we ran a number of studies and we learned not only how hurt, how much suffering and stress and turmoil was caused to just huge numbers of forcibly displaced people in the world, including here in Israel, from places, refugees and asylum seekers arrived here from places in East Africa like Sudan and Eritrea. And we found in study after study, and we did studies in the community, we did studies outside of a detention center, and we did studies with Physicians for Human Rights and inside a central bus station, and inside this amazing NGO called Kuchinate that cares for Eritrean women. We found over and over that asylum seekers who reported relating to their experience, to their bodies, to their minds, to their memories in a way that was more aware now of that experience and in a way that was more compassionate, were repeatedly and consistently had recovered at higher rates and were more resilient. And once we sort of understood the scale and the scope of the severity of harm done to these populations, we're talking about post-traumatic stress levels of 50 to 80% in the community, and similarly high rates of suicidality and depression and violence in the community and at home, we understood that we need to do something. We need to transition from just study to training. And it became clear that mindfulness may not only be associated with recovery and resilience, but it also is relatively low cost, can be delivered by a host of different kinds of paraprofessionals, and not only psychiatrists. It's disseminable and implementable on a number of different kinds of platforms. It's delivered in groups. There's evidence that it has quite robust effects with respect to buffering the effects of stress on physical health and mental health. And so we were inspired to try.
And so you're developing a research program at the moment, going forward. What do you think is the future potential of using mindfulness with people who are in such extreme trauma?
So over the course of a number of years, really talented students and staff and members of the African asylum seeker community here in Israel, we worked together to develop something that we refer to as mindfulness-based trauma recovery, MBTR, for refugees. And it's a group-based 9-session intervention that targets mindfulness and compassion in a way that's trauma sensitive, adapting these different practices so that they're experienced, so that refugees who are even fearful of closing their eyes can feel safe engaging in those practices. And of course, adapted socio-culturally to the sort of very diverse backgrounds of forcibly displaced people across the world. I can share that during the making of the film, we actually hadn't finished running the randomized controlled trial, but now we have. And in fact, I'm sort of giddy, excited to share that we actually submitted the paper, first efficacy and safety paper, to yesterday for peer review. And I think, despite and I can share very briefly that effects were actually much more positive, much larger, and even more, I think the word is more transformative than I'd thought. Our initial intention was just to provide asylum seekers, refugees, moments of refuge, moments of safety in their bodies and minds when they're so often so vigilant and so stressed. And what we found, in fact, was that those moments of refuge for really quite a significant number of refugees, asylum seekers in this population, led to recovery processes, significant improvements in post-traumatic stress, and depression, and in anxiety, and in reduced multimorbidity, and even some improvements in well-being. We also found that it was, to our surprise, very safe for the entire spectrum of asylum seekers who participated, including those with really very, very severe trauma backgrounds.
So are there any concerns that you have in the future with mindfulness research and dissemination, little, problems that you think may be something you'll have to deal with?
Am I concerned? I don't think I'd say I'm concerned. I think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And so despite, I think, my and our best of intentions and our hopes and our sort of aspirations for what we hope to be able to do for people who are struggling for no fault of their own, just because of, the sort of cruelty of humanity or injustice, and because life is hard, can be hard. I think what's essential is for our scientific community who's working around these interventions to do what we describe as ambitious, rigorous, and compassionate science, to really understand for whom do these types of interventions work, under what conditions are they most optimal, for whom are they safe, how do we disseminate them, how do we reach those who are most vulnerable and in greatest need, what kind of impacts does that have? Are we talking about mostly mental health? Are there physical health benefits? Might these interventions buffer intergenerational trauma? And so there's a great deal of work to be done. I can also share that that's really the heart of what in our group we call the Moments of Refuge project, which is this global project bringing together partners, NGOs, refugee community members from around the world, different academic organizations, all the way from Madison, Wisconsin to Cape Town in South Africa, to try to do this type of large-scale, multi-site study of mindfulness-based trauma recovery.
And can you just tell us how Mogos is doing, the man who was featured in the film, since the film was recorded?
Yeah, Mogos is dear to my heart, I have to say. Well, I'm both like really happy and also sad to share that Mogos got asylum in Canada. And so we miss him, but he's in Toronto, where it's no longer absolutely freezing. But he's doing well, and in fact, he's working very hard right now to gain admission to university to continue his studies, and I'm actually quite sure that that he's going to succeed to do so.
Wonderful. Craig, in the film you say something like, if economic success were the recipe for happiness, then everyone would be blissfully happy, but they're not. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that we go about our day-to-day life with a lot of unquestioned assumptions, ideas we've taken on somewhere or other. And I think one of them, in this sort of very material age that we're living in, is that having more, getting more, will make me more happy. And that's where so much of the time the mind goes, preoccupation about wealth. And we live in a time, relatively speaking, historically, of the most affluence in developed countries around the world, the most affluence that we've ever had. We've got things, we've got convenience, we've got comfort that is unparalleled historically. And yet, for all of that, rates of depression are rising, levels of anxiety are rising. And so if material wealth by itself was associated with happiness, then we should be very, very happy. But and mind you, for major poverty, when people really are in significant poverty, then there is a relationship you can make between a level of affluence and somebody's happiness. But past a certain point, and it's not that affluent, past a certain point, there's very little relationship at all. And yet I think these are the kinds of ideas that we live our life with, and the amount of time the mind is preoccupied about money and getting things and having a new possession, that new car and so on. We don't often, I think, stop to consciously sit back and say, well, really? Because I think that's one of the interesting things when people take up a mindfulness course, and very often people say a few weeks in, I'm just questioning what my happiness is or what it's dependent on. I thought it was all about this, but now I'm not so sure. And now when I'm just letting go of a few things, I just feel more content in myself. And I'm not chasing the kinds of things that I was chasing before. And it really opens up quite an inquiry. And I think that's one of the ways in which mindfulness is more than just a little technique in reducing stress. I think it's a really, much deeper process of self-inquiry, of the pursuit of wisdom and real insight, rather than just taking on superficial ideas that we all kind of, to a greater or lesser extent, tend to take on.
The film was made before COVID-19. What do you think mindfulness might be able to offer? I think the increase of mental health concern now across the world.
Well, it's been interesting to see an escalation in the amount of interest in mindfulness during this COVID-19 episode. And I think a lot of people, for a variety of reasons, are needing some stability in very unstable times, some sort of firmer, I guess the old metaphor of, a rock, something stable within themselves in the shifting sand of all of our fears and anxieties. I think also connection, and the connection with oneself, because all of a sudden left, cut off and in your own home by yourself, people are experiencing solitude in a way that perhaps hasn't been experienced for a long time. So people are having to get reacquainted with themselves, and also to kind of connect with others in a way that's much more difficult than having to do with social media. So I think there's a lot of ways in which people are interested in mindfulness, apart from the just dealing with the anxiety and the stress, and also interest in, some people are interested in how's it going to help my immunity, my resistance to getting the thing as well. That's probably a secondary issue for most people. But yeah, so there's a lot of reasons why mindfulness would be really relevant in people's lives now.
Yeah.
So Shannon,
Lynne,
yes.
I just wanted to share that I think one of the really exciting, like both quite frightening things that's happening around refugee mental health today is the experience of forcibly displaced people who don't have safe, stable homes and lives during this episode. Um, and so many of the organizations, both governmental, international, and non-governmental organizations that normally work so hard to partner with and care for refugees and asylum seekers are already having such difficulties doing so, in North America and in Europe. And the radical impact on the African continent hasn't even started, and there are estimates of as many as 200 million people who may be infected ultimately in Africa alone. And so I think one of the things that is one of the ways that we've tried to continue to care and study refugee mental health is by developing something that we describe as Mindfulness SOS for refugees, which is an online-based, brief form of mindfulness-based trauma recovery to increase the sort of reach and access of mindfulness practices for refugees and asylum seekers, specifically now when they are under so much stress. It's a kind of, we sometimes call it a crisis within a crisis. And I think that there are examples of that all over the world right now, to many populations.
Yeah.
If I could just add a couple of other things where I think mindfulness has really been helpful for many people in the COVID-19 era, is that, we started the year 2020 with an assumption of what we thought 2020 was going to be. It was probably just a repeat of 2019, just whatever we thought, but we have assumptions, and life is going very differently. And I think mindfulness teaches us that our assumptions about the future have nothing to do with what the future will actually be. And I think that if we can approach this more mindfully, it gives us a kind of an adaptability, an ability to accept even the stuff we don't like, but a kind of a mental flexibility to adapt. And I think that's one of the really helpful and one of the really significant needs that a lot of people have at the moment.
Shannon, was there a particular point in your experiment of living mindfully where you decided that you wanted to continue to meditate beyond that year?
Ooh, I wonder, was there an actual moment? I think it became pretty clear after my experience on the silent retreat that mindfulness was a game changer for my life. I often think that aside from marrying Jules and together we have 2 beautiful sons, the retreat is the best thing that has ever happened in my entire life. And I put that down a lot to my excellent teacher, whose name was Patrick Carney, who was like a neurosurgeon in the way that he guided me through that retreat experience, and the kind of instructions that he was able to give me in order to tweak my practice in the most subtlest of ways in order to kind of create these moments of inner stillness. It's like, and it's quite difficult to talk about, this group of people are quite experienced meditators, so I think you'll all understand what I'm talking about, but it's hard to explain this to non-meditators. This something that I feel like I had been looking for my entire life, which is true inner peace. And there's no going back from that once it's been experienced. And that, I guess, yeah, if I was to say, was there a moment where I decided that it was going to become my life of living mindfully instead of my year of living mindfully, it was definitely in experiencing that. Yeah.
So, Shannon, the end results of your own experiment came back mixed. How did you feel about that? And what's the most important thing that came back for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it became really clear after the retreat that I would continue meditating, even, regardless of whatever the scientists found. So, what became really clear is that I started valuing my own subjective experience. And that was completely surprising. That was something I filled out the World Health Organization Quality of Life questionnaire, which is a subjective well-being questionnaire, as an afterthought when I was putting together the experiment. I was like, oh, you pish posh, subjective experience. I only want the hard data. And what, though, by the end of the experiment, what became clear is, as Kamina Lyle from Deakin University is heard saying in the film, in some ways, the subjective is the only thing that really matters, when we really want to know what counts. So it's still something that I struggle with a little, because I still really value hard science, and I use science as my map, as a kind of a guide to weave my way through the very murky waters of the wellness industry. So I still value science. I guess, trust my first person experience a little more.
I think that's one of the interesting things too that helped maybe one or two wise sages to get to a point of understanding mindfulness 2,500 years before science caught up, is because they were, in a very wise and conscious way, deeply reflecting on subjective experience. And then it's kind of like the learning from the inside. And now science is caught up by trying to look at it from the outside. But I don't think, you would have, wise sages of 2,500 years ago would have needed 100 randomized controlled trials to tell them that what was going on was pretty useful.
How do you reconcile that, Amit? I'm so curious to know, because this must be something you struggle with as well.
Basically, I think it's easy for us to sometimes confuse using technology to measure phenomena and science. And they're not one and the same. In science, I think about as a way of knowing, as simple as like precisely what Craig was saying, this idea of applying these kinds of ways of studying. And it's true that we want to understand phenomena across levels of analysis, across different kind of measurement modalities. And it's certainly fascinating. There's no question about that. But we have to remember that our measurement tools, which is something that at least I think many groups, our group certainly struggles with, they're okay, but they're very young. These are all very young technologies that are often kind of distal, crude indicators of what's going on the various levels of our insides. And I think ultimately with things like mindfulness practice, relationships, love, all sorts of things that are fundamentally good for us. Ultimately, we're talking about changing the way, training how we relate to our experience. That is the practice. It's changing that relationship. It's kind of like, I heard this we had a seminar this week with some grad students on a course I teach on mindfulness. And we watched a lecture by the brilliant Paul Gilbert. And one of the things he talks about is how mindfulness is kind of like, you can think about it as a way that you learn to drive your mind. It may not necessarily fundamentally change your brain. It's kind of like a car engine, but it's about learning how to drive it in a way that takes you to the places you want to go, the ways that are, you're consistent with your values, that are based on wisdom and intention. And so I actually think that if one of the conclusions that Shannon and many others have from their own experience is that they now understand their experience in a new way, that they relate to it in a fundamentally different way, I think that's the point.
Mm.
I don't think the growth of interest in mindfulness would be happening without some really good quality science and some research, because it need the both, need to not just refer to inner experience, but science can help enormously. But sometimes I think science really struggles to measure the things that we think, it can measure. And we think something does or doesn't work because we struggle to measure it properly. And the very quotable Einstein, and I hope I don't misquote him, but science is all about measurement. But I think one of his quotes was, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." and it is hard to count. It is hard to measure sometimes, but we can know something is important, and sometimes science takes a little while to catch up.
Mm. So Shannon, through this experiment, have people around you started meditating? Like, for example, has Jules started meditating?
Good question. I think Jules was born innately mindful. I think some people actually are. They just have it, they kind of know it. Craig Hassett is probably another person who was born mindful. He stumbled upon it when he was still a university student, and you didn't even find it because you were infinitely suffering, did you, Craig?
Oh, I wasn't going through the best times, but for some reason mindfulness came to mind. Well, meditation did, and I practiced what was intuitive to me.
But yeah, so Jules, he already in some ways had quite a robust mindfulness practice before this experiment began. He's a mountaineer and an adventurer, and he'd been on his own version of a silent retreat because he was at one time stuck in Antarctica for 6 weeks in a tent with a broken iPod and nothing but a John Grisham novel that had the last page removed.
That's tough.
So I think he actually has a fairly good understanding of the nature of his own mind, but he certainly, every day, he takes time out to experience his version of solitude and allow his mind to be free of stimulus from other minds, I suppose you could say. Yeah.
Mm. Well, thank you. That's been a wonderful discussion. And I just thought that before we go, I wonder, Amit, could you tell us how people can support the work that you're doing, teaching and researching mindfulness for trauma?
It's nice that you ask. Well, there's a few ways. One way is, I hope that the film brings awareness to the sort of common suffering related to stressors of our lives and mental health problems, including those on the periphery of our society, including not only forcibly displaced people like refugees and asylum seekers. And I think there's a lot of ways that people can reach out and care for those in need in their communities. So it can be amazing how close to home people can take action. I think in terms of our personal work and our dream and our aspiration to develop the Moments of Refuge project and to bring mindfulness-based trauma recovery to what I hope will ultimately be hundreds of thousands of refugees and asylum seekers, and even now to bring mindfulness SOS, online intervention, to maybe even larger numbers of forcibly displaced people around the world over the next few months. We're recruiting funding through our website. And if people are curious and they want to learn more about refugee mental health and more about mindfulness-based trauma recovery, they can go to that momentsofrefuge.com website, and they can also feel free to support our work there.
Mm. And Craig Hassett, I'm sure people are interested in finding mindfulness courses. Could you tell us about how they can access your courses and And also perhaps a little about, you know, how much meditation should we be aspiring to?
Well, firstly, in relation to the courses, the most widely accessible course for people who aren't studying or working at Monash University would be the programs that we have on Future Learn. And so that's a UK platform. And so these are 2 Monash University courses, totally free. And so that's one the best introductory one's called Mindfulness for Wellbeing and Peak Performance. And then there's Maintaining a Mindful Life. So those 2 courses are totally free. They run 3 times a year, so people can just get the link to those, register, and do them at their own leisure over the 4 weeks that the courses are open. So we've had well over 400,000 people do those courses in the last few years, and we've gathered data and found they've been tremendously helpful for work, for stress, and helping people to be more mindful. So I'd certainly recommend those. And how much to practice? Look, it really depends. I think the first point is not to think that mindfulness is just about meditation. It's really about how we live. So to be mindful when we're not on the cushion or on the chair. Look, if somebody can start with 5 minutes twice a day, that's a pretty good place to start.
Can I just add there, what John Kabat-Zinn's advice to me on how long I should meditate for was? He said you should aim to meditate for 45 minutes a day, unless you're very stressed and busy, at which time you should meditate for 2 hours a day.
I see. Okay. All right. And Shannon, just for those people who'd like to follow your journalism work, where should they go?
So my website is shannonharvey.com, and there people can find out if they're interested in hosting their own screening or their own streaming and share it with people in their own lives, in their own communities. Then they can find out more information about that.
Well, thank you so much, Shannon Harvey, Amit Bernstein and Craig Hassett. It's been a wonderful discussion, and thank you everybody for joining us. Stay safe and well.